The autumn morning brought a familiar chill to the marble halls of the Jefferson County Courthouse. Judge Michael Winters adjusted his black robes as he prepared for another mundane Monday of traffic violations and minor offenses. At 62, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he had presided over this court for nearly 2 decades. His reputation for running a strict, no-nonsense courtroom was well known throughout the county. "Next case," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from years on the bench. He barely glanced up as the next defendant approached the podium. Sarah Bennett stood straight-backed before him, her professional attire, a navy blazer and pencil skirt, setting her apart from the usual parade of traffic offenders. At 35, she carried herself with quiet confidence, her natural hair styled in neat twists, and a leather portfolio clutched in her hands. "Your Honor, I can explain the circumstances of my parking violation," she began, her voice clear and measured. Judge Winters cut her off with a raised hand. "The citation indicates you were parked in a loading zone for over 40 minutes, Ms. Bennett. These zones are clearly marked for commercial vehicles only." Sarah took a deep breath. "Yes, Your Honor, but there were extenuating circumstances. I was conducting a writing workshop at the community center, and the regular parking lot was closed for repaving. I had boxes of books to unload." "Ms. Bennett," the judge interrupted again, peering at her over his glasses. "The sign doesn't make exceptions for books or workshops. The law is clear on this matter." Around them, the courtroom continued its usual morning bustle. The court clerk typed quietly at her computer, and the bailiff maintained his stoic presence by the judge's bench. Through the tall windows, weak sunlight filtered in, casting long shadows across the wood-paneled walls. "I understand, Your Honor," Sarah replied, maintaining her composure. "But I have received verbal permission from a center staff member who said." "Verbal permissions from unauthorized personnel do not override city ordinances, Ms. Bennett." Judge Winters's tone grew firmer. "The fine stands at $150. Sarah's shoulders tensed slightly, but her expression remained neutral. She had encountered such treatment before, the subtle dismissiveness, the unwillingness to hear her full explanation. As an accomplished author who often spoke about systemic biases in her writing, she recognized the familiar patterns at play. Additionally, the judge continued, "Given your apparent disregard for the parking regulations, I'm adding a $25 court fee." A murmur rippled through the small crowd gathered in the courtroom. The additional fee was unusual for a simple parking violation, and several observers exchanged knowing glances. Sarah opened her portfolio and removed her checkbook. Her hand was steady as she wrote out the amount, though frustration simmered beneath her calm exterior. She had faced enough similar situations to know when further discussion would be futile. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said quietly, handing the check to the court clerk. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of a familiar book peeking out from the judge's bench. The Art of Mystery Writing by Lawrence Kane, the same text she used in her advanced writing workshops. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here was a man who apparently shared her passion for literature, yet couldn't see past his own preconceptions to listen to a simple explanation. She made a mental note to include this experience in her next workshop on perspective and bias in writing. Judge Winters was already calling the next case as Sarah collected her belongings. He didn't notice the way several members of the gallery watched her exit with sympathy, nor did he catch the slight headshake from his usually impassive bailiff. As Sarah pushed through the heavy courthouse doors into the crisp morning air, she pulled out her phone to check the time. She had a writing group to lead that evening, one she had founded 3 years ago to create an inclusive space for aspiring authors. A small smile played across her lips as she thought about the manuscript she would be reviewing later. Unknown to Judge Winters, who was now mechanically working through his morning docket, his own manuscript submission lay in Sarah's portfolio, waiting for her experienced editorial eye. The judge had submitted it under his pen name, making him the newest potential member of her writing circle. Sarah walked to her car, her heels clicking against the pavement. Sometimes, she reflected, life had a way of creating its own plot twists, ones that even the most experienced writers couldn't imagine. 3 days after the courtroom incident, Judge Michael Winters nervously adjusted his tie as he stood outside room 204 of the Hamilton Community Center. The evening writing group meeting would be his first, and the worn manuscript pages in his leather briefcase felt suddenly inadequate. After decades of writing in secret, Sharing his work with strangers made his judicial confidence vanish. "You must be Michael," a warm voice called from down the hall. "Or should I say, M.W. Richards?" The judge turned, and his face lost all color. There, walking toward him with a professional smile, was Sarah Bennett, the same woman he had found just days ago. She carried a stack of papers and wore a casual but elegant sweater dress, looking very different from her courtroom appearance. Yes, I'm Michael," he managed to say, his throat suddenly dry. His mind raced back to Monday morning, to his dismissive tone and the extra court fee he had imposed. Sarah unlocked the door to the meeting room, her movements relaxed and purposeful. "Welcome to the Riverside Writers' Circle. I've been looking forward to meeting the author of The Midnight Gavel. Your submission showed real promise." Judge Winters followed her into the room, feeling increasingly uncomfortable as other writers began to arrive. They greeted Sarah with easy familiarity. Clearly, she was not just another member but a leader in this community. "Everyone, please welcome our newest member," Sarah announced once the group had settled into the circle of chairs. "Michael has submitted a legal thriller that I think you'll all find intriguing. But first, let's hear from Lisa about her revised chapter." Throughout the next hour, Judge Winters watched Sarah in amazement. She led the discussion with expertise, offering insights that demonstrated deep knowledge of storytelling craft. Her feedback to other writers was both kind and precise, showing years of experience in the field. When the conversation turned to his manuscript, he nearly excused himself from the room, but Sarah's introduction caught him off guard. "Michael's story explores themes of justice and perception," she said, showing no sign that she recognized him from court. The protagonist, a young defense attorney, challenges a system that often makes assumptions based on appearances. "I found it particularly interesting given current conversations about bias in our justice system." The irony of her words made Judge Winters sink lower in his chair. Other members began discussing his work, but he could hardly focus on their comments. All he could think about was how quickly he had dismissed this accomplished woman in his courtroom. During the break, Sarah approached him as he stood awkwardly by the coffee station. "Your story has potential," she said, pouring herself a cup. "Though I wonder if your judge character could show more growth in his understanding of different perspectives." "Miss Bennett," he began, his voice low, "about Monday morning." She stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "In fiction, Judge Winters, we often give our characters chances to revise their actions. It's one of the benefits of writing. We can explore better choices, different outcomes." The weight of her words settled heavily on his shoulders. Here was a woman who had likely faced countless similar situations throughout her career, yet she maintained her professionalism and grace. "I should have listened to your explanation," he admitted. "Yes, you should have," she agreed simply. "But right now, I'm more interested in helping you develop your protagonist's voice. Your character needs to feel more authentic in her struggles against institutional barriers." As the evening drew to a close, other members packed up their belongings and said their goodbyes. Judge Winters lingered, watching as Sarah organized her notes and gathered her things. "Same time next week," she announced to the group. "And Michael, I've made some detailed notes on your manuscript. I think with some revision, you could have something special here." He nodded, clutching his briefcase. "Thank you for your feedback." Sarah paused at the door, looking back at him. "You know, Judge Winters, the best writers are those who can learn from their mistakes, both on and off the page." As she left him standing alone in the community center room, Judge Winters realized that his next court session would be very different. Sometimes the most powerful lessons came from the most unexpected teachers. The tension in room 204 could have been cut with a knife during the next week's writing group meeting. Other members sensed something was different, though they couldn't quite place what had changed. They noticed how Judge Winters, usually confident in his black robes, now sat stiffly in his chair, his face slightly flushed whenever Sarah spoke. Emma Martinez, a regular member who had been coming to the group for 2 years, leaned over to whisper to Lisa Chen, "Is it just me, or is the new guy acting strange?" Lisa shrugged, watching as Sarah led the group through their weekly writing exercises. Today's topic was writing authentic characters, and Sarah had prepared a special presentation on the importance of understanding different life experiences. "Let's discuss how our own biases can affect the way we write characters," Sarah announced, standing before the whiteboard. Her eyes briefly met Judge Winters. and he quickly looked down at his notebook. Often, we make assumptions about people based on limited information. These assumptions can weaken our writing and limit our understanding. The judge's pen pressed so hard against the paper that the tip nearly broke. He was acutely aware that Sarah was using this teaching moment to address more than just writing technique. For example, Sarah continued, "Imagine a character who's a successful professional woman. What assumptions might people make about her? What challenges might she face that others don't see?" Several group members offered suggestions, but Judge Winters remained silent, remembering how quickly he had dismissed Sarah's explanation in his courtroom. Each comment from the group felt like a personal rebuke. During the break, he found himself alone by the snack table, arranging cookies on a paper plate he didn't really want. Sarah approached, picking up a coffee cup. "Your revised chapter is up for discussion next," she said casually, adding cream to her coffee. "I noticed you made some interesting changes to the judge character." Judge Winters cleared his throat. "Yes, I've been doing some thinking about perspective lately." "Perspective is everything, isn't it?" Sarah replied, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "Both in writing and in life. You know, when I started this writing group 3 years ago, many people assumed it wouldn't last. They made judgments without knowing the full story." The cookie in Judge Winters' hand crumbled slightly as his grip tightened. "Miss Bennett, I need to apologize properly for—" "Your latest chapter," Sarah interrupted smoothly, "shows promise. The judge in your story begins to question his own biases. It's a start, though I think you could dig deeper into his emotional journey." Before he could respond, other members began returning from break. Judge Winters watched as Sarah effortlessly switched back into her role as group leader, commanding respect without demanding it, something he realized he could learn from. The discussion of his revised chapter was both enlightening and uncomfortable. His story about a judge facing his own prejudices felt painfully autobiographical now. "I appreciate how the protagonist starts to recognize his blind spots," one member commented, "but I wonder if the transformation feels too easy." "Good point," Sarah added, making notes on her copy. "Real change usually requires more than just one moment of realization. It's a journey of many small steps and constant self-reflection." Judge Winters found himself nodding, understanding that she wasn't just talking about his character anymore. The weight of his actions in the courtroom, and countless other potential moments like it, pressed heavily on his conscience. As the meeting drew to a close, Sarah handed him his manuscript, now filled with detailed notes in red ink. "Your writing is improving," she said quietly, "but remember, the best stories come from a place of truth and understanding." The other members filed out, chatting amongst themselves about their weekly writing goals. Judge Winters lingered behind, staring at the marked-up pages in his hands. "Next week," Sarah called from the doorway, "we're discussing character growth and redemption arcs. I think you'll find it particularly relevant." Left alone in the room, Judge Winters flipped through his manuscript, reading Sarah's careful annotations. Each comment was professional and focused on improving his writing, with no mention of their courtroom encounter. Her ability to separate their past interaction from her role as his writing mentor made him feel even more ashamed of his previous behavior. He realized that tomorrow's court sessions would require a different approach. Perhaps it was time for the real judge to show the same growth as his fictional character. In his chambers, Judge Michael Winters sat alone with his morning coffee, arriving earlier than usual to reflect. The past few weeks of writing group sessions had stirred up memories from his 30-year legal career, making him question decisions he'd never second-guessed before. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph, his law school graduation day. Young Michael stood proudly in his cap and gown, full of ideals about justice and fairness. Next to the photo lay his first attempt at creative writing, a short story written during a lonely night of studying for the bar exam. "Your Honor." His clerk, Jenny, poked her head in. "Court begins in 20 minutes, and there's something you should see." She handed him a local newspaper. There, in the arts section, was a feature article about Sarah Bennett. The photo showed her at a book signing, and the headline read, "Local author's latest novel tackles systemic bias in legal system." His hands trembled slightly as he read about Sarah's accomplishments. 3 published novels, a prestigious writing award, regular speaking engagements at national conferences, And most importantly, her dedication to mentoring aspiring writers from all backgrounds through her community writing program. "I had no idea she was so well known," Jenny commented. "Isn't she the woman from last month's parking violation case?" Judge Winters nodded, remembering how he cut off Sarah's explanation and added that extra fee. The article mentioned her upcoming book about a black female attorney navigating prejudice in the justice system. He wondered how many of those experiences came from encounters like the one in his courtroom. As he prepared for the morning session, he thought about his own writing journey. Ever since his wife passed away 5 years ago, writing had become his secret escape. Late nights spent crafting his legal thriller had kept loneliness at bay, but he'd never had the courage to share his work until now. The morning docket proceeded differently than usual. When a young Hispanic man tried explaining why he'd missed a court date, Judge Winters listened patiently, learning about the man's 2 jobs and sick mother. When an elderly woman struggled to understand her citation, he took extra time to explain the process clearly. During lunch break, he pulled out his manuscript, reviewing Sarah's latest notes. "Consider how your judge character's background shapes his worldview," she had written. "What experiences made him who he is? What might make him change?" His phone buzzed with a reminder about tomorrow's writing group meeting. He'd been working on a new chapter, one where his fictional judge confronts his own biases after a chance encounter forces him to see beyond his predetermined judgments. "Art imitating life," he muttered, shaking his head at the irony. That afternoon, while hearing a case about a parking dispute between neighbors, he found himself asking more questions, seeking to understand the full story rather than jumping to quick conclusions. His clerk noticed the change, shooting him surprised glances throughout the proceedings. After court adjourned, Judge Winters remained at his bench, pulling out his writing notebook. He began sketching out a new scene, one he hadn't planned. In it, his protagonist visits the home of someone he'd unfairly judged, seeing for the first time the real person behind his assumptions. The cleaning staff arrived, vacuuming around him as evening settled in. He barely noticed, too absorbed in his writing. For the first time, his words felt truly authentic, born from real understanding rather than mere imagination. His phone buzzed again, an email from Sarah with the next writing group assignment. "Write about a moment of personal transformation from your character's perspective. Focus on the internal struggle between maintaining the status quo and embracing change." Judge Winters leaned back in his chair, looking up at the imposing seal of justice on the wall behind him. How many times had he delivered judgments without truly seeing the people before him? How many stories had he failed to hear? He began packing his briefcase, placing his manuscript carefully inside. Tomorrow, he would share his new chapter with the group, but more importantly, he would return to this bench with fresh eyes and an open mind. As he walked through the empty courthouse, his footsteps echoing in the marble halls, Judge Winters realized that his greatest lesson about justice hadn't come from law school or his years on the bench. It had come from a writing group and the author he'd once dismissed. Sarah Bennett sat in her home office, surrounded by stacks of manuscripts and publishing contracts. The wall behind her desk displayed framed covers of her 3 novels, each one a milestone in her journey as an author. As she reviewed submissions for the next writing group meeting, her mind wandered to the unexpected presence of Judge Winters in her class. Her assistant, Maya, entered with a fresh cup of tea. "Your agent called. They want to know if you'll be addressing the courthouse incident in your upcoming book tour." Sarah shook her head, setting aside Judge Winters' latest chapter. "That's not the story I want to tell. Besides, something interesting is happening in that writing group." Maya raised an eyebrow, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. She had been with Sarah since the first novel, watching her navigate both success and prejudice in the publishing world. "You know," Sarah said, picking up Judge Winters' manuscript again, "when I started the writing group, I wanted to create a space where everyone's voice could be heard, even those who might have silenced others." The manuscript pages showed clear progress. The judge's writing had evolved from stiff, procedural descriptions to more nuanced character development. His latest chapter featured a judge confronting his own prejudices after a chance encounter with a community activist. Sarah remembered her own early days as a writer, attending workshops where she was often the only black woman in the room. Those experiences had fueled her determination to create something different, a space where diverse voices could flourish. "Did you see this morning's article?" Maya asked, sliding over the local newspaper. The headline read, Judge Michael Winter's recent rulings show marked shift in approach. Sarah smiled, unsurprised. She had noticed subtle changes in his writing that reflected a deeper transformation. His characters had become more complex, their struggles more authentic. The parallel between his growth as a writer and as a judge hadn't escaped her notice. Rising from her desk, Sarah walked to her wall of inspiration, a collection of photos, letters, and news clippings that chronicled her journey. Among them was a rejection letter from her first novel, citing concerns that readers might not relate to a black female protagonist in legal fiction. That rejection had strengthened her resolve. 3 novels later, her books were breaking barriers and changing perspectives. The writing group was an extension of that mission, creating opportunities for voices that needed to be heard. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lisa, another writing group member. Is it just me, or is Judge Winter's new chapter actually really good? Sarah began typing her response but paused. The judge's transformation reminded her of why she had started this journey. Change was possible, even in the most unexpected places. Returning to her desk, she pulled out her current manuscript, a story about transformation and second chances. The protagonist, loosely based on her own experiences, was a writing instructor who believed in the power of stories to bridge divides. Maya gathered her things to leave. Don't stay up too late. You have that speaking engagement at the law school tomorrow. Just one more chapter to review, Sarah promised, though they both knew she would lose track of time, absorbed in her work. Once alone, Sarah opened her laptop and began writing a new scene for her novel. In it, our protagonist encounters a student whose biased worldview begins to crack when forced to write from another person's perspective. The evening light faded as Sarah worked, adding depth to her character's journey. She understood that real change, like good writing, required patience, honesty, and the willingness to revise one's perspective. Her phone buzzed again, an email from Judge Winters requesting a one-on-one consultation about his latest chapter. The message was humble, acknowledging how much he had to learn, not just about writing, but about seeing beyond his own limited viewpoint. Sarah replied with a suggested meeting time, then returned to her novel. Her protagonist's words flowed onto the page. Sometimes the greatest stories come from those moments when we're forced to question everything we thought we knew. Outside her window, the city lights began to twinkle. Sarah smiled, knowing that tomorrow's writing group would bring new opportunities for growth and understanding. After all, every good story needed space for its characters to evolve. The coffee shop near the courthouse buzzed with afternoon activity as Sarah and Judge Winters sat in a quiet corner booth. Their manuscripts lay between them like a bridge connecting 2 very different worlds. This was their first meeting outside the writing group, a conversation both had known was coming. I've been meaning to have this talk for weeks, Judge Winters began, his hands wrapped around his untouched coffee cup. His judicial demeanor had been replaced by something more vulnerable. About that day in court. Sarah held up her hand, mirroring his own gesture from that courtroom morning. Before we discuss that, I'd like to hear about what inspired you to start writing. The question caught him off guard. He shifted in his seat, looking down at his manuscript. After Margaret, my wife, passed away, the house became too quiet. Writing helped fill the silence. And why legal thrillers? Sarah asked, making notes in her ever-present notebook. I thought I knew the justice system inside and out, he said with a bitter laugh. 30 years on the bench, and I'm only now realizing how much I've missed. A server brought Sarah's tea, and she took a moment to stir in honey. Your latest chapter shows that realization. The scene where your judge character watches court proceedings from the gallery, that was powerful. I sat in my own courtroom last week, Judge Winters admitted. In the back row, just watching. It was enlightening to see how intimidating it all appears from the other side. Sarah nodded, remembering her own experiences on that side of the bench. Sometimes we need to change our perspective to see the full picture. I've been unfair, he said quietly. Not just to you that day, but probably to countless others over the years. I let my position, my assumptions. He trailed off, struggling to find the right words. You let them write the story for you, Sarah finished, instead of listening to each person's actual narrative. Yes, the judge's shoulders sagged with the weight of this acknowledgement. I'm sorry, Ms. Bennett. The way I treated you in court was inexcusable. Sarah took a sip of her tea before responding. You know what interests me most about your writing, Judge Winters? Your characters have the capacity for change, even the ones who start out seeming irredeemable. Outside the coffee shop window, people hurried past, lawyers clutching briefcases, courthouse staff heading home, citizens going about their daily lives, each one carrying their own story. I've been revising my novel, Judge Winters said, pulling out a fresh set of pages. The judge character. He's not the hero anymore. He's the one who needs to learn and grow. Now that, Sarah said with a genuine smile, is an interesting character arc. They spent the next hour discussing his revisions, but the conversation kept weaving between fiction and reality. The judge shared stories from his early days on the bench, now seeing them through new eyes. Sarah talked about her experiences in the publishing world, the assumptions she'd faced, and her determination to create change through storytelling. As the coffee shop began to empty, Judge Winters gathered his courage to ask the question that had been nagging at him. The extra court fee I imposed that day, it was because I didn't fit your narrative of how a professional should look or act. Sarah suggested gently, because you've had the power to make assumptions without consequences. The judge nodded, shame coloring his face. The fee has been reversed, he said quietly, and I've been reviewing similar cases from the past 6 months. There's a pattern I hadn't seen before, or hadn't wanted to see. Sarah gathered her things, preparing to leave. You know what makes a story compelling, Judge Winters? Not just acknowledging past mistakes, but showing what happens next. What changes will your character make now that his eyes are open? Standing to leave, Judge Winters extended his hand. Thank you, Ms. Bennett, not just for the writing guidance. Sarah shook his hand firmly. See you at group tomorrow. We're discussing character redemption arcs. Her smile held both warmth and challenge. I have a feeling you'll have some insights to share. As they parted ways outside the coffee shop, both knew that their conversation had been about much more than writing. Sometimes the most important stories were the ones that forced us to rewrite our own assumptions. The next few weeks brought noticeable changes to Courtroom 3B. Regular attendees whispered about Judge Winters' transformed demeanor. Gone was the stern, unyielding authority figure, replaced by someone who listened more and assumed less. On this particular morning, he paused during proceedings to ensure a Spanish-speaking defendant had a proper interpreter. During a minor traffic case, he took extra time to explain the process to an elderly woman who seemed confused. His clerk, Jenny, could hardly believe this was the same judge who once rushed through his docket with mechanical efficiency. All rise, called the bailiff as court resumed after lunch break. Judge Winters adjusted his reading glasses, noticing a familiar face in the gallery. Sarah Bennett sat quietly in the back row, notebook in hand. She had mentioned wanting to observe his court for research on her new novel. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave a slight nod before turning to the next case. Your Honor, in the matter of Thompson versus City Transit, began the prosecutor. As the case unfolded, Judge Winters found himself applying the same careful attention he now gave to his writing. He looked beyond surface details, asked clarifying questions, and considered perspectives he might have previously overlooked. During a brief recess, he retreated to his chambers and pulled out his latest manuscript draft. Sarah's red ink notes covered the margins. Show us the judge's internal struggle here, and what makes him question his long-held beliefs? A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Jenny entered with a newspaper. Judge, you might want to see this. The local paper's editorial page featured a letter from a recent defendant, praising the changes in Courtroom 3B. For the first time, it read, I felt truly heard in a courtroom. Judge Winters took the time to understand my situation, not just my violation. He folded the paper carefully, thinking about his latest writing group session. They had discussed how real character growth often inspired others to change as well. He'd noticed other judges beginning to adopt some of his new approaches. Returning to the bench, Judge Winters saw Sarah still observing from her seat. She was taking notes, probably gathering material for her book. He wondered if his former self would appear as a character, a reminder of how blind justice could sometimes be. Later that afternoon, a young black woman appeared before him for a speeding ticket. 6 months ago, he might have simply imposed the standard fine. Instead, he asked about the circumstances. I was rushing to pick up my son from daycare, Your Honor, she explained. I'm a single mother, and if I'm late, they charge extra fees I can't afford. Judge Winters listened carefully, remembering Sarah's writing advice about understanding characters' motivations and challenges. Have you looked into the city's after-school programs? He asked, pulling out a resource guide he now kept at his bench. In the gallery, Sarah smiled, jotting something in her notebook. That evening, as the courthouse emptied, Judge Winters walked past the rows of portraits, all previous judges who had sat on this bench. Their stern faces looked down at him, representatives of a system that had often prioritized efficiency over understanding. He found Sarah waiting in the lobby, closing her notebook. "Productive research day?" he asked. "Very," she replied. "Though I noticed you didn't tell that last defendant about your own daughter struggling with daycare costs 20 years ago." He blinked in surprise. "How did you?" "You mentioned it in Chapter 3 of your manuscript," she said. "Those personal experiences shape how we view others, once we let them." They walked together toward the parking lot, discussing how his real-life changes were influencing his writing, and vice versa. His fictional judge had become more complex, more human, just as he had. "By the way," Sarah mentioned, "the writing group loved your latest chapter, especially the scene where the judge admits his mistakes to a defendant he wronged months earlier." Judge Winters smiled. "I had good inspiration for that one." As they reached their cars, Sarah handed him a copy of her latest novel, hot off the press. "Your story isn't in here," she said, "but your growth as a writer, and as a judge, helped shape it." He accepted the book, noting the dedication page, "To all those who have the courage to revise their own stories." The setting sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as they parted ways, each carrying lessons learned from their unlikely partnership. Sometimes the best teachers appeared in the most unexpected courtrooms. 8 months after their first courtroom encounter, Sarah Bennett once again stood before Judge Michael Winters. This time, however, she wasn't there for a violation. She sat in the gallery, watching proudly as he addressed a graduating class of new law clerks. "Justice," he was saying, "isn't just about applying the law. It's about understanding the stories behind each case that comes before us." His eyes met Sarah's briefly, acknowledging the source of his transformed perspective. The courthouse's main hall was packed with young lawyers, their families, and veteran court staff. Among them sat the entire Riverside Writers' Circle, there to support both Sarah and the judge. Their writing group had become something of a legend in legal circles, especially after Judge Winters' article about bias in the justice system was published in the State Bar Journal. "When I started my career," he continued, "I thought I knew everything about justice. I was wrong. Sometimes our greatest lessons come from unexpected teachers." In the front row, Jenny, his clerk, smiled knowingly. She had witnessed his transformation firsthand, watching as his courtroom became known as a place where everyone's story deserved to be heard. After the ceremony, well-wishers gathered around a table where both Sarah and Judge Winters sat, signing copies of their books. His legal thriller, published under his own name rather than a pseudonym, sat alongside her latest novel. Both books dealt with themes of justice, prejudice, and the power of personal growth. "Your Honor," a young black law clerk approached their table. "Your story about the parking ticket that changed your perspective, was that real?" Before he could answer, Sarah laughed. "Very real. I have the receipt to prove it." The judge shook his head, smiling. "The fine was reversed, as you well know, though I keep that receipt in my chambers as a reminder." Later, as the crowd thinned, the writing group gathered for their usual Wednesday meeting. But today, they met in Judge Winters' chambers, surrounded by law books and the weight of history. "It seems fitting," Sarah said, opening the session, "to end our year here where our story began. Judge Winters has an announcement to share." He stood, holding a document in slightly trembling hands. "Thanks to Ms. Bennett's guidance, both in writing and in life, I've been appointed to lead a new judicial training program. We'll be working with judges across the state to address implicit bias and improve court accessibility." The group applauded, many wiping away tears. They had witnessed not just his growth as a writer, but as a person committed to making real change in the system he served. And Sarah added, standing beside him, "We'll be co-teaching a course at the law school next semester. Narrative Justice. Understanding the stories behind the cases." Emma, one of their longest-standing group members, raised her hand. Does this mean we're losing both our mentors? Never, Sarah assured her. This group is where real change begins. One story at a time. Judge Winters nodded, looking around at the faces that had become like family. Besides, he added, I still have a sequel to write. As the meeting wound down, Sarah and Judge Winters found themselves alone in his chambers. The setting sun cast long shadows across his desk, where that original parking ticket still sat framed, a reminder of how far they both come. Did you ever imagine, she asked, that a parking violation would lead to all this? He shook his head, picking up their two books lying side by side on his desk. You knew, didn't you? That day in court, you knew exactly who I was and what I needed to learn. I knew you had a story worth revising, she replied with a smile. We all do. From the courtroom next door, they could hear the evening cleaning crew, preparing for another day of justice tomorrow. But now it would be a different kind of justice, one that listened more carefully, judged less quickly, and remembered that behind every case was a human story waiting to be heard. As they walked out together, their steps echoing in the marble halls, both author and judge knew their story wasn't really ending. It was just beginning a new chapter, one that would ripple out to touch countless other lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Sometimes the most powerful changes in life came not from grand gestures or sweeping reforms, but from simple moments of understanding and the courage to rewrite our own stories.